and the gallery key left on her pillow. I found the brass key by accident at 3 in the morning, when the apartment had surrendered to sleep and the city was a rumor outside the blinds. It was small and ordinary, something your grandmother might have owned, and balanced on the edge of our pillow like a punctuation mark. I held it up to the lamp and the metal looked foolishly hopeful. Mason was asleep beside me, breathing the slow, even breaths of someone who has decided the world will keep its promises. We had been together 6 years, years that make you fluent in half-phrases and gestures. That night we'd argued before bed about something ridiculous, socks on the radiator, the sort of argument that leaks into things that matter if you let it. But then we made up with a tangle of hands and vows that sounded rehearsed even when we meant them. The key, though, was not a rehearsed thing. It was a new verb in our drawer. I turned it over and noticed the tiny tag tied to the ring, a scrap of paper with a single word, studio. The handwriting was not mine. It was neat in a way that suggested deliberation, the kind of neatness a person uses to make a secret look respectable. I slid the key into my pocket and slept with it like contraband. The next day I moved like a man who had swallowed a small, unannounced geography. Mason asked about it as we poured coffee. He asked the way people ask when they suspect the answer will not be a noun but an accusation. I said I'd found it in the laundry room, true if vague. He nodded as if this were a sufficient explanation and returned to the chess game he played with the newspaper, one eye on the page, the other on me. Curators are excellent liars because handling other people's lies is part of the job. I manage narratives. I rearrange objects so people understand history differently. At the gallery, I walked through the white rooms with the key heavy in my blazer pocket, feeling like a man carrying an uncharged battery. The opening was a week away. We had a show to hang, press to answer, donors to placate. Usually work makes me disciplined. This time it made me dangerous with possibility. I called the number on the tiny tag that evening, thumb worrying the brass like a man testing for truth. A voice picked up, low and certain. "Studio C," it said. "Come any time after 7. When I pushed open the studio door, the space smelled of turpentine and oranges, and a kind of fatigue that looks like dedication. Paintings leaned against the walls as if deciding whether to forgive the day. A man was there, sleeves rolled, the sort of hands that had the calluses of someone who makes promises to surfaces. He looked up from a canvas, and the room reconfigured itself around him. His name was Aaron. He had a jaw the city appreciated and a quiet that was not absence, but instead a different sort of attention. He did not move like someone trying to seduce. He moved like someone who had practiced being gentle and saw no reason to quit. We started with work. We always do. And I found myself staying because conversations with Aaron made architecture of feelings I'd been treating like detritus. We met after hours then. What began as innocuous talk about angles and pigments became something with a rhythm of its own. He asked about my life as someone curious rather than acquisitive. I asked him about his technique, and he answered with the ease of someone who trusts their hands more than their mouth. There was an electricity to being seen by someone who did not have a stake in the marriage you wore like a badge. He did not ask me to be a different person. He asked me to notice the parts of myself I had hidden under steadying habits. When he touched me the first time briefly to clean a smudge of paint from my knuckle, the air felt like it had taken a breath that did not belong to either of us. It was an intimate act disguised as care, and I liked the shape of that camouflage. We began to time the meetings. After the gallery closed, a quick visit to see a drying piece, a shared bottle of cheap wine, fingers that learned the cartography of each other's wrist. We never planned beyond that. We did not need to. The risk itself was the architecture in which we sketched our escapes. I felt guilty in ways I had never before felt. Guilty not because I had crossed a line, but because the line existed. Mason was reliable in ways that made his hands familiar interiors, not because he was incomplete, but because I had made a life out of habit. He baked sourdough on Sundays and left notes on the fridge in a handwriting that had once excited me. He called me midday with a joke about a donor's complaint. He trusted me enough to ask, "Do you want to go see that restoration?" And meant it. It hurt to be the source of his small faith. With Aaron, the world allowed itself to be sharper. The art studio made a climate soft enough for the things I had been avoiding. We kissed like men who had read the instruction manual for desire and found it written in small, dangerous fonts. The first time we slept together, it was not an earthquake. It was an accord. Our bodies agreed in a language neither of us had to translate. Afterwards, we stayed on the couch, the sunlight a rectangle on the floor, and I felt the knotted disappointment of a man discovering a new color he must catalog for someone else. I bought a cheap notebook and kept 2 columns, one for what I owed Mason, groceries, honest conversation, the grocery list, and one for what I discovered with Aaron, light at the edge of a canvas, the exact way his laughter softened when a line went right. The lists were both true. They were also inadequate. Secrets have a metabolism. They consume oxygen and make everything else feel less necessary. I began to find excuses for being late home. I started mentioning exhibitions that required late cataloging. Mason noticed. He always notices. Once, he returned early with a new loaf and found the kitchen empty except for our lives like an abandoned play. He sat at the table and read the paper until I came in with paint under my nails and the smell of oranges. That night he asked me to sit. He had a careful look, the one people use when dealing with damaged things. He did not raise his voice. He said, "You check in with me. Tell me where you are. We promised no surprises." I sat and watched my hands look like they belonged to the wrong person. "I know," I said. He kept his tone gentle and asked, "Is there someone?" I thought about that brass key, the way it had balanced on the pillow. The truth is a weight you learn to carry evenly or it rips a shoulder. I placed the studio key on the table between us like a small, alien relic. Mason stared at it for a long time. I could watch the gears in his face. He did not pick it up. He did not show that it hurt. Instead, he made tea. He moved in the kitchen with the kind of practiced care he used on my shirts, folding, stacking, arranging. It was an act of making things as if they would not break. When he sat back down, his hands were warm from the pot. "I won't pretend I don't understand curiosity," he said, "but I will not have lying." That was the cleanest threat I had received. It did not come with dramatics. It came with the steadiness of someone who had built a life in an attempt to keep the small things intact. "There are things I need," I began to say. I had planned 1,000 confessions and none of them landed like truth. "I don't know how to do this without breaking you." He looked at me as if cataloging everything I had been. "We will not be a place that holds your Saturdays for strangers," he said. "If this is over, be over. If it's a detour, let us be honest about it." So I told him. I told him the wrongs and the rights, the quietness and the new light that had made my hands remember a different grammar. I told him about the key, the studio, and Aaron's hands. I expected a thunderstorm or a desert, and instead he sat there like whether I had to respect. He left the small apartment the next morning and wrote on a post-it, "Take the time you need. Don't make a stranger of us." He left a list of things for me to do. Call the donor about the missing check, pick up the dry cleaning, be home by dinner if I could. The list felt like a map draped over a wound, practical, unsubtle, terrifying because it implied endurance. I went to the studio that day and Aaron looked at me and didn't ask me to be less complicated. He asked me softly whether I had told Mason. I had. He listened, and then he kissed me like the world was both tender and fragile. "If you stay," he said when we were breathless, "stay without bargains. If you go, go clean." I kept the key in my pocket, and I kept two lives on an even keel until the evening I realized that the clearest cruelty would be to try to have both without either knowing, to eat breakfast with someone whose knuckles were mine, and to sleep beside a stranger who smelled of turpentine. It felt like theft, and I was unwilling to be a good thief. The decision was not a drama. I met Aaron at dawn by the river, and we cataloged our small, honest theft together. We admitted we had been reckless and kind, that we had offered each other salvage, that our affair had the dignity of two people making each other better, and the tragedy of making other people collateral. I left the studio with the key in my hand and drove across town. Mason opened the door in his slippers, and when he saw me, he did not ask where I had been. He let me take his hand, and in that ordinary touch I found a place to begin again, or end, honestly. We unpacked the lists. We read them aloud and added things. Small apologies, the promise of therapy, time, a way to rebuild trust, or a pathway to disentangle. In the end, we did not make a decision that would make sense on every chart. We made one that fit the geometry of our failure and the stubbornness of our love. We agreed to a period of truth-telling, to be exact with locations and feelings, to allow the hurt to be a subject we did not ignore. It was not heroic. It was not cinematic. It was procedural, like restoration work. Sometimes the most radical thing you can do is to be present for the work of salvaging another human. I keep the brass key now in a small wooden box on my desk. It is not a relic of victory or shame. It is the map of a night that taught me the cost of convenience. Mason and I make tea with the same care he once used to arrange my shirts. We argue and make up and try to remember the rules we wrote when the cost was still theoretical. I go to Aaron's studio sometimes when honesty says it is safe, and we speak like people who have undone and learned. The brass is still warm from being in my hand. It reminds me that some doors must be opened, some left closed, and that the most treacherous thing is to assume any path will be only one thing. The ticket to temptation, call it what you will, doesn't vanish. It sits in the left pocket with my keys and a receipt for the coffee I forgot to drink. Sometimes, late at night, when the city is a rumor outside the blinds, I take it out and look at the tiny tag with studio, and I remember the way another man once taught me to notice color. I do not regret learning. I regret only the ways my learning hurt the people who trusted me to be simple.